O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
And now I want to transition over to the document to give a little bit more of a historical overview of this guy and really why he's important and why he's probably also forgotten. At least for us in the West, I was not fully aware of him. I mean, and outside of Orthodox circles, which we already love, sort of obscure history, it was one of my brothers at church that was actually quite knowledgeable of the Baron and kind of educated me. So I put this a little bit together on the Mad Baron, and fascinating yet often forgotten historical figure, uniquely captivating historical personality. So as we said, he's a Baltic German aristocrat and a white Russian warlord, operated during the turbulent era of the Russian Civil War. He's a fusion of different ideologies, combined European conservatism, Russian Orthodox monarchism, Vajrayana Buddhism, and Mongolian shamanism, and attempted to establish a Buddhist theocratic monarchy in Mongolia. Complex character, psychological portrait, leadership style, brutal yet charismatic. He did seem to be very charismatic, and people wanted to follow him, especially due to his heroism. But eventually, people tended to turn against him just because of how brutal he really was. Known for severe military discipline and ruthless violence, anti-Bolshevik and anti-Semitic actions, personal contradictions and asceticism. So he practiced strict celibacy, inspired by religious and monastic traditions, specifically in Orthodoxy, and yet paradoxically engaged in heavy consumption of alcohol, hashish, and opium. Religious mysticism, again, this sort of divine warrior myth. Mongolians saw him as a divine warrior and possibly the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. And this was due to, again, some of the local prophecies and religious symbolism, effectively legitimizing his rule and inspired loyalty. And this was, the Dalai Lama never officially canonized him or identified him as the incarnation of one of the god of wars, because there's multiple gods of wars, or gods of war. But the Dalai Lama did sort of give credence to this and saw his actions in the taking over of Urga, the capital of Mongolia, as beneficial. And so he kind of, whether he fully believed it or not, the Dalai Lama, he certainly kind of capitulated and went along with the local reverence and belief that this man was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and a reincarnation of one of the gods of wars. And his belief in reincarnation, I saw on one thing, it said that he told one of his soldiers or something that when he beheads one of his enemies, he actually considered that him giving them a blessing. One, they didn't have to experience torture, but two, he thought it prevented them from potentially reincarnating into a further sissified entity, an animal, another man or a woman, of something of that sort. So he thought, if you're willing to get on your knees and bow before me and I'll cut your head off, at least you'll die with some respect. And I don't know. Some of these legends are hilarious about this guy. Significant historical actions and impact. Again, he's not the most important historical figure during this period, but as I said, successfully captured Urga, and then reinstated the Bogd Khan as ruler. That's the Tibetan ruler of Mongolia. And then influence on Mongolian history. His short rule accelerated Mongolia's subsequent alignment with the Soviet communism, had lasting geopolitical implications for Mongolia's future, and then downfall and execution. Ultimately, he was betrayed, defeated by the Bolshevik Mongolian revolutionary forces. So he found out that some of the Mongolians were actually sympathetic to the Red Army and began attacking them in Mongolia proper. And so they fled into Russia and were reinforced by the Red Army. And so the Mongolians and the Red Army then, because the Mongolians knew Mongolia, knew the terrain and how to move and operate, they helped the Red Army sort of retake Mongolia. And so he was eventually betrayed and captured by his own troops in 1921. And this led to his execution, as I said. So it became a tragic emblem of revolutionary upheaval and ideological extremism. And then speculations on maybe some of the neglect or historical neglect and his importance is that he was kind of geographically in a peripheral context. I mean, most of his story, especially the interesting parts, occur over in Mongolia and Siberia. Complex ideological syncretism is difficult for conventional historical narratives. What exactly is this guy? How do you kind of define him? Or I mean, because it's such a hodgepodge of beliefs. Is he just a sort of pragmatic guy that's all about power? I think maybe to some degree you can make that argument, but he seemed very devout to his Buddhist, his like quasi Christian, it's almost theosophical, Buddhist, shamanic belief system, this weird spirituality. And it reinforced his own identity because he is not only the local Mongolians that believed that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, he believed he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. And so, overshadowed by dominant Bolshevik narratives. And then why I think he's important, he offers unparalleled insights into the religious syncretism, charismatic authoritarianism, the violent clash between traditionalism and modernity in Eurasia. And it merits greater attention, both scholarly studies and popular historical discourse. So in regards to this document, I'm not going to read all of it. If you guys want access, again, this whole thing's going to be posted over at the website by tonight. And the last one we did on satanic cults and ritual abuse, that's up at the website as well if anybody wants to see that one. So we know he was born from in Estonia. He's German, aristocrat family. And this kind of gives a little bit more detail to some of the stuff we talked about. Personality and mystical beliefs. I have more on this, but as we said, he combined extreme military discipline and promoted what's called military Buddhism. So obviously Buddhism is supposed to be nonviolent, but there's a sort of theological, philosophical thread within it that sort of condones and advocates for a sort of Buddhist supremacy through military conquest. And he advocated for that type of tradition. And so he combined extreme military discipline with esoteric mysticism, believing himself to be the reincarnated legendary historical figures, including Genghis Khan, and a prophetic agent tasked with restoring traditional monarchy and spirituality to a decadent modern world. His soldiers, although fearful of him, revered him for his supposed invincibility and supernatural powers. And this has to come through the way that he acted during actual battles. And so importance and legacy, his embodiment of ideological extremes in the Russian Civil War, violent anti-Bolshevism, reactionary monarchism, mysticism, and militant eschatology. So we're going to get into, I have a section here on his beliefs on Jews. And it's like he still had like a Christian eschatological framework amongst all the syncretism, because he believed that the Jews were sort of Antichrist spirit, or at least were operating to subvert monarchies and traditions and what he believed to be God-appointed hierarchies of authority, and that this was part of a larger nefarious spiritual battle that he believed communism and Judaism were synonymous, and that he then placed a lot of the blame on Jews. So symbolizing the chaotic political and spiritual vacuum following the collapse of the Russian Empire. And it illustrates the intersection between militarism, religion, and politics in the early 20th century, and influencing later figures, especially fascist and nationalist groups, drawn to his esoteric reactionary beliefs and charismatic authoritarianism. And some people have speculated that maybe the Third Reich was aware of this or interested in some sort, because we know that they had a connection back to Tibet, and that's where they get the swastika, of course, the counterclockwise swastika that's notorious with Nazism, and that type of stuff. So people speculate. I have a detailed chronological timeline I put together of his life, so it kind of lays it out. And that's one of the amazing parts, guys. This guy died at the age of 35. I'm 35 right now. And so I was thinking about everything this guy did up to the age of 35. Now, he wasn't like a great world ruler. I mean, this isn't Alexander the Great or something, but just very interesting, right? Early 20th century, and very interesting guy. So this whole timeline here, if you guys are interested, you can check that out. And then here's more on his religious beliefs. So he was born into a Baltic German nobility, was originally raised within the framework of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which was dominant among the aristocratic military circles in Imperial Russia. And the way I kind of framed his early uprising had a profound belief in traditional hierarchy, monarchy, and divine order. That is quite clear. View of himself as a defender of the Christian monarchy against Bolshevism, which he saw as demonic and apocalyptic. And a commitment to traditional moral order reflected in his stringent disciplined lifestyle and conservative moral values, especially regarding sexuality. Now, as we said, he was also a bit of a drunkard and loved to smoke both opium and hashish. So I said, however, his embrace of orthodoxy was not orthodox in practice. I've seen some Orthodox kind of appeal to Roman online on X, and I think it's kind of hard to couch this guy or describe him as an Orthodox Christian. But his personality, extreme mysticism, and fascination with Eastern spirituality gradually led him away from standard Christian theology into a realm of like mystical syncretic spirituality. So influence from Buddhism and shamanism. Again, we're talking about Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism. While stationed in Siberia and Mongolia, Ungern became deeply enamored with Tibetan Buddhism, particularly its Vajrayana branch, characterized by belief in reincarnation, which he held throughout the rest of his life, and mystical empowerment, the existence of supernatural protectors, fierce deities, and enlightened beings who intervene in human affairs, which he thought, again, he was a reincarnation of one of these gods of war, and a strong millenarian and apocalyptic dimension, expecting transformative religious and political renewal. He aligned these ideas with his vision of restoring traditional monarchy, seeing Mongolia as a center of spiritual renewal to cleanse the world from decadence and materialism. His alignment led him to embrace Mongolian and Tibetan prophecies about a warlike savior who would restore purity and power in Asia. And then regarding shamanism, he was influenced by the belief in ancestral spirits, nature spirits, warrior ghosts guiding his decisions, practices of divination, prophecy, spiritual guidance through shamans, oracles, and seers, and shamanistic rituals performed before battles to ensure victory, to invoke warrior spirits. And then why the Mongols believed he was the god of war. So the Genghis Khan mythology is that Mongolians traditionally revered Genghis Khan as a semi-divine figure destined to return or reincarnate to restore greatness and liberate the Mongols from foreign oppression. At the time, Mongolia was under Chinese occupation. This is who, again, Ungern-Sternberg throws out of Urga. And Ungern's military success against Chinese forces strongly resonated with prophecies of a returning Genghis Khan figure who would liberate the Mongols. Appearance and behavior. Ungern deliberately embraced Mongol warrior symbolism, dressing in traditional Mongol clothing, adopting Mongolian customs, and explicitly claiming spiritual authority. He skillfully, in regards to prophecies and omens, he skillfully utilized Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist oracles, prophecies, and omens to legitimize his rule. His successful conquest of Urga in 1921 seemed miraculous, fulfilling local prophecies that fueled the belief that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. Remember, he did this while being massively, massively outnumbered, and he fooled them by lighting all these fires around the city. And because of the prophecies of the people within the city, the Chinese who were occupying it thought, what if they're right? What if this guy's coming to kill us all? And again, very interesting historical context with all of that. And then his repeated victories against numerically superior enemies seemed supernatural, reinforcing the belief in his divine mandate and identity as the god of war. And then celibacy, moral discipline. He viewed sexuality as spiritually weakening and distracting from his divine militaristic mission. Celibacy was seen as preserving spiritual strength and martial purity, crucial to his self-concept as a divine warrior ascetic. And this is true not only within, some Christian cultures, but generally speaking, I mean, even contemporary, wasn't Mike Tyson was famous for not sleeping with women a month before his fights, but throughout history, I mean, you watch the movie The Northman, which is about sort of Nordic paganism. And in the beginning of the movie, when the protagonist, his father, comes home, who is king of one of these pagan Nordic tribes, his wife wants to sleep with him. And this was all part of a betrayal. He's getting ready to be betrayed. Betrayed. The king is, and his wife's in on it. She's actually sleeping with another guy. But the king refuses to sleep with his wife because he says, "I need the strength for battle." And so this idea that men's strength was tied with their semen, and that ejaculation actually weakened you and was deleterious in regards to battles and military expeditions, that is a common motif across ancient and medieval culture, just FYI. But the paradox is that he had no problem. So he wouldn't have sex, but he had extensive alcohol use. It was widespread amongst the Russian officers, reflecting a cultural acceptance as well as a coping mechanism for stress and violence of wartime. Alcohol was integrated into his daily military and religious rituals, used to enhance camaraderie, courage, and a sense of divine inspiration. And then hashish and opium. Ungern was used hashish and opium primarily for spiritual and ritualistic purposes, influenced by Mongolian shamanistic and Tibetan tantric traditions, which occasionally use mind-altering substances to achieve altered states of consciousness. Now, here I want to get into his beliefs about the Jews, because it's very interesting. And if you look up anything about the guy, they always talk about him being, anti-Semitic, this or that. Guys, smash that like. We only got 69 likes on the stream. I thought this topic was pretty interesting. I thought more people would actually find it a bit more of an interesting topic, something that we don't talk about all the time. So guys, smash that like. And if you have questions or comments you'd like to support streams like this, please send in a question or some type of support. Would greatly appreciate that. Okay, so Ungern's beliefs about Jews. So Judeo-Bolshevism. So Sternberg saw Jews as the primary architects behind the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, believing it was part of a broader Jewish conspiracy to dismantle traditional Christian civilization and imperial authority. And so again, this is ironic, right? This guy is a Mongolian, Buddhist, shamanic type incarnation of the god of war, and yet his animosity towards them had to do with his belief that they were undermining Orthodox Christian civilization in Russia. He viewed Bolshevism as inherently Jewish in origin, character, and intent, adopting widely circulated narratives popular among Russian monarchist, conservative Orthodox circles, and right-wing groups at the time. This was all couched within a very interesting apocalyptic framework. So he considered Jews not simply political adversaries, but spiritually malevolent figures, agents of chaos who undermined religious values and order. Ungern-Sternberg integrated these thoughts with his eclectic religious beliefs, perceiving Bolshevism as a demonic force in a literal spiritual sense, and positioning himself as a divine warrior battling this perceived evil. Role of Jews in the destruction of Russia. So he explicitly blamed the Jews for Russia's collapse into revolutionary chaos. He believed they deliberately orchestrated social upheaval, economic sabotage, and political destabilization. To him, Jewish intellectuals, revolutionaries, financiers, and journalists were collectively responsible for subverting Russia's Orthodox Christian identity and dismantling its imperial order. And he accused the Jews of exploiting the revolutionary period's turmoil to seize power, destroy traditional morality, and corrupt Russian society with atheism, materialism, and revolutionary socialism. He adopted a racialized stereotype common among European thought at the time, which characterized Jews as inherently deceitful, cunning, morally corrupt, greedy, parasitic, and subversive, and saw Jewish communities as fundamentally alien elements threatening the racial and cultural purity of Russians and Mongolians alike. Because there's a famous instance in which, when he took over Urga, they hung and executed all Jews within the city. His beliefs drew heavily on the infamous protocols of the Elders of Zion, widely circulated in reactionary Russian military and monarchist circles, reinforcing his belief in a Jewish global conspiracy. Political manifestations. Ungern-Sternberg's anti-Semitic beliefs translated directly into brutal violence during his brief rule in Mongolia. His regime actively orchestrated violent pogroms against Jewish communities. Bolshevik sympathizers and individuals merely suspected of sympathizing with communism or revolutionary ideologies Jews captured during his campaigns were typically executed, tortured, or subjected to public violence. Ungern explicitly framed these actions as necessary purifications against Bolshevik conspirators and subversive elements, justifying atrocities as part of a sacred religious war against evil. And then Ungern-Sternberg systematically propagated these beliefs amongst his soldiers and the local Mongolian population, creating widespread paranoia. His personal hatred and suspicion translated into policy and practice, legitimizing anti-Jewish sentiments within the ranks of his Asian Cavalry Division. And then connection with the broader right-wing movements at the time, Ungern-Sternberg's ideas paralleled the broader European right wing emerging after World War I, especially within defeated monarchies and right-wing paramilitary groups across Eastern and Central Europe. He positioned himself within a broader global struggle against what he saw as a Jewish-driven communist threat. I did find this article, and this was one of the first articles I read in regards to who this guy was after learning about him at the men's group. And so the ghost of Genghis Khan. After the Russian Revolution, one young officer forged a career so strange that it went down in legend. Tim Newark examines the short and bloody life of Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg and recalls his bizarre mission to create his own barbarian empire in the Russian Far East. So some of this kind of goes over his early life. I'm going to skip some of that. I want to get into it. Provides details in regards to his relations with the Mongols and stuff that isn't in any of the videos and isn't specifically in my document. So we're going to kind of skip around this document here, but it says, when the Russian Empire fell in the second decade of the 20th century, it brought a time of civil war and feuding warlords. Out of this context arose a man who startled even his bloodthirsty contemporaries with the extent of his violence. But then again, this man believed he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, one of history's greatest conquerors, and that he was on a mission to recreate the great Khan's barbarian empire. The man was Baron Ungern-Sternberg, one of the strangest and cruelest military figures of the 20th century. And so this goes into his origins, his family, yada, yada, yada. As a young man, barely in his 20s, Ungern-Sternberg's hungry mind was filled with stories of Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire. And this was translated into reality when he was himself put in charge of a troop of Mongol horsemen. He immediately found a kinship with them, admiring their innate martial skills and fearlessness in battle. He wanted to be like these silent, frightening warriors and made a step towards this by adopting Buddhism. And so there's a photo of him. You can see him with one of his medals on. So not a physically dominating figure. It says a rare photograph of Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Increasingly, his men came to see him not as a great commander, but as a suicidal madman. A world on fire. Gives you a little bit of the historical context. Ungern-Sternberg loathed the Bolsheviks. He pledged to restore the Tsar to his throne and then wipe out the revolution mongers among the white races. His hatred of the communists was no doubt intensified when he heard of their crushing blows against his own homeland of Latvia. Now, in his early 30s, he was a formidable warrior in his own right. Fighting for 4 years in the war against the Germans, he displayed great courage and leadership, being rapidly promoted to the rank of Major General and awarded the Cross of St. George. His fellow officers had learned to respect and fear him. Only his reckless courage prevented his being cashiered by various commanding officers under whom he had served, recorded a contemporary. When Ungern-Sternberg entered a cafe, other occupants retired, for he was an expert with his gun. In his drinking bouts, he slew many of his own officers. So that was another thing, is that he was in multiple duels, which actually got him in problems with his Russian superiors, because he would go into battle. Again, he would do these heroic things, but he was always getting in conflict with people. And again, this guy ran towards death. And so if you guys got into a drunken argument with him in a tavern, he would challenge you to a duel pretty quickly. And he was very serious about it. And he killed multiple other soldiers due to these duels. In July 1918, the Tsar and his family were executed. And by the 1920, the Great Civil War between the white and red Russians had ground to a halt with the crushing of the counter-revolutionaries by the Bolsheviks, Ungern-Sternberg found himself out on a limb in the middle of Siberia with his beloved Tsar gone and the White Russian army disintegrating. He now sought his own barbarian destiny. The land of the Mongols that he so admired had been invaded by the Chinese, who had taken advantage of Russia's misfortunes to increase their own empire. Believing himself by now to be the new Genghis Khan, Ungern-Sternberg was certain it was his duty to release the Mongols from their Chinese yoke. With an army of ex-White Army Russians and native warriors, he would rebuild the empire of the Mongols and then march against the revolutionaries in the West. So Ungern-Sternberg's army numbered approximately 6,000 warriors, 4,000 of these being ex-White Army Russians, the rest being Mongols or other Siberian horsemen. To this were added the Japanese advisors and some 70 armored bodyguards donated by the Dalai Lama in Tibet, who had been promised an extension of his religious realm if the Baron was successful. Ungern-Sternberg had also fulfilled his self-image as a Mongol warlord by marrying a Mongolian princess who traveled with the army in the company of the Baron's Buddhist spiritual advisors. And then his barbarian fantasy. So let's see. Do I want to read all this stuff? We'll read a little bit of it. With the bizarre entourage, Ungern-Sternberg advanced into Mongolia in October 1920. Dmitry Alyoshin described the Baron as wearing an exotic combination of cherry red Chinese jacket with blue Imperial Russian army breeches and surrounded by barbaric luxury and glory. Before his army, refugees began to stream, fueling the stories of his barbaric behavior. Alyoshin recorded the appalling punishments meted out to anyone who crossed the Baron's path. The village of Bulakti was burned with the inhabitants locked in their huts. Captain Vishnevsky was whipped to death. The Baron strangled Colonels Lihachev and Yahontov. His adjutant killed Kordakov just to get his young and pretty wife. And the target of Ungern-Sternberg's campaign was Uruga, which we've discussed, the capital of Mongolia. And then in the 26th of October, Ungern-Sternberg led his attack on the Mongolian capital at night. Ladislao Forbath, a Western traveler and trader within the city, described the impact of the assault. Quote, "Suddenly there came a high-pitched hiss, immediately followed by a terrific explosion, and a cloud of dust rose in front of the horse. We guessed that Baron Ungern-Sternberg was bombarding the Chinese barrack close by, and we were confirmed in this belief as grenade after grenade explode in front of the house." And then we're going to get into the suicidal bluff. So how did he take over a city that was outnumbered by Chinese? So on the night of the 31st of January in snow and darkness, Ungern-Sternberg's horde returned to the hills outside Uruga as he instructed his men to begin another assault. This time he employed psychological warfare in order to give the impression of a far greater army than he in fact possessed. The Baron had some of his men light fires in the surrounding hills so the Chinese might think that his army had encircled them. According to Alyoshin, the Baron's army had dwindled severely owing to the initial lack of success in the bitter winter. There were now only 1,700 bandits against 12,000 Chinese soldiers. This was a suicidal bluff that Ungern-Sternberg had no other choice if he had wished to fulfill his barbarian fantasy. As 0 hour approached, very high winds came across the Mongolian steppe and delayed the arrival of the Baron's ox-drawn artillery, and it was drawn by the time that the main attack began. With the shock of surprise lost, the Chinese were able to scramble to their guns and let loose a storm of shells and machine gun fire that hammered the attacking Mongols and Russians. The Mongol horsemen were particularly vulnerable to the sustained fire and also least likely to hang around to be mowed down, unlike the Russian veterans of World War I. A special assault squad of Russians and Tibetans had greater luck. They successfully managed to free the Bogd Khan, the living Buddha, from Chinese imprisonment, also grabbing a store of Chinese ammunition and machine guns in the palace, which they rushed to the main battlefront. And so here's this was the living Buddha right here, the Bodha Khan. And then, like I said, this was one of some of his bodyguards. Look how big that Mongolian dude is. The morale amongst the Chinese defenders was low, and over 3 days, at least 2,000 Chinese soldiers deserted. On the third day, Ungern-Sternberg led his final attack. Immediately, the Chinese opened unsystematic and mad shooting, recalled Alyoshin. Machine guns began their dreadful cluttering. The temptation was too great, and contrary to orders, we dashed forward into battle. The Baron was carried away by the mad impulse also, as we saw him galloping on his white horse in the front of our lines, directing us toward the enemy's barbed wire. Hand-to-hand fighting quickly followed, with the Russian cavalry attacking the Chinese from the rear. Alyoshin gives a frightening vision of the barbaric chaos. Mad with revenge and hatred, the conquerors began plundering the city. Drunken horsemen galloped along the streets and killing at their fancy, breaking into houses, dragging property outside into the dirty streets, dressing themselves in rich silks found in the shops. In front of the Chinese banks, lines were formed where each man was given the right to plunge his bloody hand inside the strong boxes and get what his luck would bring him. Some were fortunate enough to drag out gold coins and bullion. Some were less fortunate and got silver, while others found only paper currency and banknotes, which they immediately threw into the street as worthless. This was all after a barbarian army. Worse was to follow in the 3-day orgy of violence. On the morning of the 4th day, Ungern-Sternberg ordered an end to the bloodshed, rape, and plunder. Many of his warriors were too drunk to notice, having sometimes shot their own comrades in the chaos of the moment, and these were strung up immediately as a warning to the rest. A shopkeeper somewhat rashly asked the Baron if the corpses hanging outside his shop could be cut down, as he was losing valuable business. There's one legend about the Baron too, that he had like a wild pack of wolves, and that some of the tortures he administered was allowing the wolves to eat people. And there was one thing that I read that some of his subordinate soldiers did something that bothered the Baron. I forget what exactly it was, but he basically forced them to wrestle his wild wolves. So pretty interesting legends regarding this guy. And through luck and bluff, Baron Ungern-Sternberg had achieved his barbarian destiny. He now lived like an ancient warlord, surrounded by the gilded trappings of a Khan on the steppes, along with his Mongolian princess. Protecting him were Buddhist bodyguards clad in medieval armor, and a horde of Cossack and Mongolian horsemen, all defended by an array of 20th century weapons. With this vision of himself as the new Genghis Khan completed, he set about preaching a crusade in which he declared it was the duty of every white Russian and every Mongolian to crush the Reds and destroy the communist realm. His ambition now fully inflated, Ungern-Sternberg pulled up his tents and advanced northwards out of Mongolia toward the road of Urga near Lake Baikal, with the intention of cutting the Trans-Siberian Railway line between Irkutsk and eastern China. In the 27th of May of 1921, on the advice of his soothsayers, Ungern-Sternberg declared himself Emperor of all Russia. For the ears of the Reds in Moscow, he made one further pledge: to plant an avenue of gallows from Mongolia to Moscow, from which he would hang every Bolshevik he could lay his hands on. Quote, "The tribes of Genghis Khan's successors were awakened," the Baron told his followers. Quote, "Nobody shall extinguish the fire in the heart of the Mongols. In Asia, there will be a great state from the Pacific and Indian Ocean to the shore of the Volga. The wise religion of Buddha shall run to the north and the west." And so here's a photo. So a killing field of Mongolia showing piles of bones and skulls left behind by Ungern-Sternberg's army, which executed all prisoners. So this is you can see all the skulls and bones. And then Final Destiny, it just gets into how he was eventually betrayed by his fellow soldiers who wanted to mutiny due to his desire to cross the Gobi Desert. And And so we'll read a couple. When the whites gained the upper hand, the Baron was true to his words of retribution. We shot every prisoner, wrote Alyoshin. The prisoners were forced to dig large communal graves at which they were subsequently lined up. Photographs survive of the killing fields taken a few years later, in which piles of bleached skulls and bones lay scattered on the bleak Mongolian steppe where they fell. Realizing they could expect no mercy whatsoever, the Bolsheviks fought with the tenacity and even more cunning than the Baron. The Mongolian Bolsheviks, so again, the Mongols who found refuge amongst the Red Army, could see their own great barbarian prize to be plucked out of the chaos of civil war, and they possessed a power as violent and ruthless as that of the Baron. In many ways, Ungern-Sternberg had met his match in the form of another Mongolian warlord. Even the Baron's men were becoming weary of the constant struggle as they looked on their leader, now without a jacket and wearing on his naked chest numerous Mongolian talismans and charms hung on a bright yellow cord. They saw not a great commander, but a suicidal madman. In the middle of a cold Mongolian night, a small number of Baron's warriors crept out of their tents and assembled a machine gun in front of their commander's ornate yurt. Praying to their gods, while they pulled the trigger, the machine gun tore through the panels of felt, throwing splinters of metal and wood everywhere. When the gunners paused, they were shocked to see the Baron was still alive, running out of the chaos to mount his horse and disappear into the darkness. Maybe the Baron truly was the ghostly reincarnation of Genghis Khan. The Great Crusade was over, however. Hounded by the Red Army and the Mongolian communists, the White Army disintegrated, with many of the Russians escaping to China. Urga fell to the Red Army, and Mongolia became a communist nation. A few diehards accompanied the Baron into the wilderness, but he was badly wounded, and his mind no longer able to conjure up any plan. Alyoshin accompanied him until, bleeding, exhausted, and helpless, Baron von Ungern-Sternberg slid from his saddle and fell to the ground unconscious. Days later, a Red Army patrol came across the Baron, writhing in agony as he tried to shake giant ants off his body. Uncertain of who this half-eaten figure was, a Russian cavalryman dismounted and stepped towards him. "Who are you?" he asked softly. "I am Baron von Ungern-Sternberg," screamed the broken man in response. The Bolsheviks threw Ungern-Sternberg over the back of one of their horses, and according to the Times of 13th September 1921, he was exhibited as a monster at stations across the Trans-Siberian Railway. At Novosibirsk in Siberia, he was put on the trial for his many crimes. Unsurprisingly, the Soviet court found him guilty and sentenced him to death several times over. On the 15th of September in 1921, he stood in front of a firing squad and smiled before a crack of gunshots finally ended his barbarian fantasy.
When the Russian Civil War broke out as a direct result of the Bolshevik Revolution in late 1917, several anti-communist commanders took up arms to fight the Red Army. Among the stories of all those intriguing commanders, with each one a story so brutal, heroic, and tragic as the others, was one Cossack commander who truly stood out in eccentricity. Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was of Baltic German noble origin, but fell in love with the Far East, its history and culture. He was convinced he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, adopted a hybrid ideology of combined Buddhism, Christianity, and samurai influences, and led his clique of merciless Cossacks in brutal battle against the communists. But not before conquering Mongolia, albeit for a brief while, and declaring himself its head of state. He waged a campaign of terror without any mercy towards his opponents. Still, at the same time, according to historians, a modern-day independent Mongolia would not be possible without his activities. He became known as the Mad Baron in history books, an epitaph that is rather fitting for this larger-than-life character. And soup serve and access available accounts that I can't already see a plan on code. In 1886, Roman was born into a noble Baltic German family in Graz in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Although his mother was German and his father, Theodor Freiherr von Ungern-Sternberg, was of Baltic German descent, the young boy spoke German, English, Estonian, French, and Russian. When he was just 2 years old, the von Ungern-Sternbergs moved to Reval, modern-day Tallinn, in the Russian governorate of Estonia. Roman grew up there, traveling between Reval and his family's estate, situated on the island of Hiiumaa. His parents divorced during his childhood. His father was committed to a mental asylum, and his mother remarried the Baltic German Oskar von Heuningen-Huene. Already as a child, Roman was obsessed with romanticized accounts of his ancestors. Teutonic knights conquering the Baltic states, but also of Mongols and their domination under Genghis Khan. At the root lay the belief that the Ungern-Sternbergs were related to a descendant of Genghis Khan, although no conclusive evidence supports this. Besides enjoying and losing himself in the tales of old, he was a nasty kid. Stories revealed he bullied kids and bullied bullies. He tortured animals, and on more than one occasion, parents forbade their kids to interact with him. His grades suffered, although he did excel in sports and physical activity. He was expelled from the gymnasium in Revel, upon which his stepfather enrolled him in the Imperial Naval Academy in St. Petersburg. Roman, who began referring to himself as Ungern von Sternberg, was a dedicated monarchist and patriot, but describing him as an ideal officer would be far from the truth. In fact, he loathed protocol, formalities, and he shunned the elite networks of nobility he had access to. Ungern preferred to spend his time with regular soldiers, enjoying the raw lives and crude humor. And when war broke out with Japan in 1904, he eagerly jumped at the opportunity to search for action and adventure in the Far East. He served in the Imperial Russian Army during the Russo-Japanese War, although by the time he arrived at the front, most of the fighting was over already, and Russia soon accepted their defeat. This was the first time he visited the Far East of Russia and rubbed shoulders with the Mongolian, Chinese, and even Japanese cultures. 8 years after the war ended, Ungern received the Service Medal, casting doubt on the generally accepted narrative he did not see action. During the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 Russian Revolution spread through Russia. Although not conclusive in dethroning Tsar Nicholas for now, peasants in rural areas did take up arms against the upper classes. The same goes for Estonian peasants, who reportedly burned down Ungern's family estate. When news reached him, as he himself was still in the Far East at this point, he allegedly developed utter contempt for the masses, thinking of them as no more than wild animals. This only cemented his ultra-nationalist and monarchist convictions, having a deep-seated hatred against moderate or left-wing movement. Clearly, he didn't fit in with the other Russian officers. Whereas they all attempted to acquire prestigious postings close to Europe, 22-year-old Roman was sent to Transbaikal. Translating to beyond Lake Baikal, frankly, searching for postings further away from Europe could be pretty challenging. Located at the Russian-Mongolian-Chinese border in South Siberia, Roman served as an officer among the Amur Cossacks for the next 5 years. Having a notoriously short temper, he engaged in at least one duel during this time. He thrived there, though, and for the rest of his life he would both feel a connection with the Cossacks and with the Siberian and Mongolian regions. But when in 1914 the First World War broke out, he was sent to the European front. Ungern served in multiple Cossack units at the Eastern European and Southern Caucasus front, fighting against Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. From 1914, he spent 2 years fighting in Galicia, current-day Ukraine, and Poland. Now, something you should know about the Eastern Front in the First World War is that It saw just as much, if not more, senseless slaughter as the Western Front. Infantry and cavalry charged into machine guns without much regard for human life, and Cossack casualties were exceptionally high, sometimes even quadruple the number of regular units. Ungern commanded the Zabaikal Cossacks regiment and quickly made a name for himself because he tended to volunteer for the most dangerous charges. And when charges were taking place, he rode at the head of the cavalry unit, charging into barbed wire, machine guns, and the general horror you would expect trench warfare to bring. Throughout the war, Ungern received every possible order an officer of his rank could receive, including the Order of St. George, the highest military decoration for commissioned officers. Another Baltic German officer of the Imperial Russian Army, Pyotr Wrangel, also known as the Black Baron, wrote about Ungern in a rather revealing manner. He lauded his heroism and self-sacrifice, describing his natural state as that of war. Yet he also criticized him, writing that among officers and other noblemen, he acted out. He simply could not properly participate in more sophisticated circles and adhere to etiquette, resulting in constant reprimands, fights, and disciplinary measures. This came to a head in 1916, when a fight with another officer escalated into a duel. The fight was the straw that broke the camel's back. Ungern's superiors were fed up with the recalcitrant horseman and threw him in military prison. When they released him in December that year, he was transferred to the Caucasus, where the war against the Ottomans was waging on. Here, Ungern served under Captain Grigory Semyonov. This mustached Cossack captain had part Buryat ancestry and spoke both Mongolian and Buryat fluently. These languages and cultures weren't especially popular among certain elites, but the raw Cossack cavalrymen proved a welcome asset against the Ottomans. Semyonov and Ungern-Sternberg hit it off thanks to their shared appreciation for Mongolian culture and the fact both men weren't exactly popular among their peers. Contemporaries and historians alike credit them with brutal personalities both to enemies and their own soldiers. By 1917, Ungern reached the rank of Vojskovoy Starshina, the equivalent of lieutenant colonel for Cossacks. Around that time, the two men attempted to organize an Assyrian Christian regiment to take up arms against the Ottomans. But during the fighting in the Caucasus and recruiting troops in modern-day Iran, developments behind the front line steered Russia's history in a wildly different direction. The Russian Empire was one of the great empires that collapsed as a result of the First World War. In 1917, the February Revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, and later that year, the Bolshevik Revolution marked the beginning of what would become the Soviet Union. But not before many different war parties fought an incredibly bloody, brutal, and gruesome civil war, where both the Bolsheviks and the so-called whites spared nobody opposing them. These loosely organized white military units consisted of monarchists, conservatives, but even liberals, as long as they opposed communism. In the Caucasus, the Lieutenant General Anton Denikin commanded an anti-communist volunteer force. In the southwest, the Black Baron Pyotr Wrangel commanded the Caucasus Volunteer Army. The fair-mustached Nikolai Yudenich led troops in the Baltics. And in the Far East, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself supreme leader and commander-in-chief of all Russian land and sea forces. Ungern, a convinced monarchist, bloodthirsty and ready as ever for war, joined the White Army together with Semyonov, who assumed command of the Baikal Cossacks and became their ataman. Although the White Army sounds like a unified front against the Bolsheviks, it in fact consisted of a wide variety of groups and stakeholders. Due to the vast size of the former Russian Empire, many of these groups weren't even in contact with each other, although they fought on the same side. Ungern's goal for the next few years was to restore the Romanov monarchy, preferably by putting Grand Duke Michael on the throne. It is widely assumed he never became aware of Grand Duke Michael's execution, which took place in June 1918. Ungarn had always been a strange fellow at any rate, I'm sure you agree. But around this time he supposedly had a spiritual revelation from Buddha. Since that moment, he was convinced he was Buddha's reincarnation, tasked with restoring Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. Historians noted Ungarn fused strains of Christianity and Buddhism together with other spiritual influences, such as asceticism and Japanese samurai customs. That didn't mean he lived an entirely pure life, as prescribed by Christianity, because his own form of spiritual belief system allowed for the generous consumption of alcohol and prolific bloodshed. Ungern and Semyonov, together with their cavalry unit, trekked eastward towards Outer Mongolia and eastern Siberia, basically the Transbaikal region Ungern was stationed in a decade before. In February 1919, Ungern formed his multi-ethnic Asiatic Cavalry Division, operating under Semyonov's command. He became a robber baron, terrorizing the local population with indiscriminate killings and theft, leading many locals to side with the Red Army, often just as bloodthirsty as Ungern's Cossack unit. In late summer 1920, Ungern and his cavalry unit invaded Mongolia, embroiled in its own war of independence against Chinese troops. About 7,000 Chinese troops held Mongolia's capital, Urga, modern-day Ulaanbaatar. Enjoying support from Mongolian clergy, the Imperial Japanese Army, and the 8th Bogd Gagin, the Great Khan, Ungern made plans to capture Urga. His first besiegement failed, but the second time, together with 1,500-odd men, he managed to capture the city, defeating the Chinese troops. They restored the 8th Bogd Khan, who awarded Ungern the title of Hereditary Grand Duke Darkhan Koshoi Chin Wang in the dignity of Khan. Semyonov promoted Ungern to lieutenant general. The small Jewish population living in Urga was massacred. Any suspected communist they caught was subject to torture before execution. Ungern also established his own secret police, which became notorious for its disregard for human lives. Yet when Ungern's power was somewhat consolidated, although by no means do I mean it was a stable situation, did he introduce oddly progressive policy. He founded a library for the people, established schools for the youth, attempted to reform the economy, issued religious tolerance edicts, excluding Jews, and appointed offices for public sanitation and keeping the streets clean. When it came to prisoners, Ungern allowed the Mongolian populace to buy the freedom of those arrested in order to improve their karma. Still, Ungern's unpredictable behavior led to issues among the higher ranks, not to mention that his officers misbehaved and were described by contemporaries as a bunch of brutal warriors, taking pleasure in the execution of enemies, and sometimes even ordinary citizens. Pursuing his goal of establishing a great Mongol Khanate with himself at its head, Ungern made many enemies. In the north, the tide of the war was rapidly shifting in the Bolsheviks' favor, with many White Army commanders surrendering and fleeing or being captured and executed. When Ungern captured Urga and took control, many Mongol nationalist and communist sympathizers fled over the border into Russian territory. They formed the Mongol government in exile and received support from the Red Army. These revolutionaries rejected the 8th Bogd Khan and Ungern's presence. In March 1921, they launched an invasion into Mongolia. Not aware of the Reds having conquered the majority of the Siberian territory, Ungern was convinced he enjoyed support from Mongol and Siberian locals. He agreed to meet a Red Army envoy in Siberia, but he barely received local support when he arrived. Leading a severely weakened cavalry unit, Ungarn engaged in multiple battles against the better equipped and numerically superior Red Army throughout the summer. In July, Urga was captured by the Red Army. Realizing he wouldn't be able to recapture Urga, Ungern traveled to Transbaikal in an attempt to replenish his forces. Penetrating deep into Russian territory, he had to retreat when he realized large Red Army units chased him. Fleeing to Mongolia again, he made plans to cross the Gobi Desert and reach Tibet. Having barely any supplies, his near-suicide mission to Tibet led to his demise. Fed up with his exceedingly erratic behavior, even his most loyal officers mutinied at this point. In August, following a failed assassination attempt, his men tied him up and sold him to a guerrilla Red Army detachment. After a 6-hour show trial, 35-year-old Ungern was executed by a firing squad. These eerie images are photographs of the moment right before his execution. And like that, the life of the Mad Baron ended, a moving and tumultuous life. He supposedly swallowed his Order of St. George and other military medals to prevent them from falling in godless communist hands. Although this is based on hearsay, I think the fact it is plausible he did just that proves how much of an unconventional person he was.